Hey everyone, welcome back to Tactical Magic. This is Molly Mandelberg, your host, and I'm here with Janna Stam. And today we're talking about communication and ways to expand your capacities with communication, especially if you're an entrepreneur, if you're out there building a business where you need to talk to people. Focusing on how you communicate, how you connect with other people can be a really valuable place to put some of your attention. It's really easy to think this is just how I am, or this is just how I show up, or this is just how I relate to other people. But the truth is we are constantly evolving, and we are so capable of digging in deeper and learning more about how interrelations and interpersonal connections can deepen, and how those deepening experiences can actually really serve us in our professional capacities, in our professional world. So I'm excited to have somebody who focuses on that heavily in their work. Hang tight for just a sec. We'll be right back.
It's not just about mastering technology. It's not just about brand or messaging. It's not just about making more money. It's about showing up in a big way so your people can find you. This is about bringing your most wild and authentic self into the hustle and grind. Welcome to Tactical Magic, a business strategies podcast for the warrior goddess entrepreneur.
Awesome. Welcome back. So Janna Stam has, for more than 15 years, provided strategic communications guidance and support to clients, including technology innovators, professional services, insurance providers, healthcare organizations, and financial advisors. Known for her sensitivity, incisiveness, and strong grasp of critical details, her podcast, Access Ideas, and Audiobook Reviews in 5 minutes help crystallize abstract concepts and convey a love of ideas. Welcome to the show, Janna.
Thanks so much, Molly. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you found your way into this world of strategic communications.
Sure. I grew up in a family with a lot of open conflict and tension, and I was always intrigued by people who could make peace and bring a conversation into a more positive space just with words. And I think that was always something that drew me in. So when I became more interested in communications in the working world, I was completing things like communications plans and strategies, but I was also paying really careful attention to leaders and salespeople and colleagues who just were that much more effective because of how they communicated. So over the years, I've taken a few lessons along the way, but I think if I were to say my motto or one piece of advice to take away from this is communication is really a practice. It's not a hard skill. It's a soft skill. Just like any soft skill, we can lose the ability, lose that over time. So it really is a practice, just like yoga, or we practice meditation, or we practice our routine of the day, whether it's fitness or our business plan strategy. But it really is a practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that you can do to really get the most out of that practice.
I love that. Yeah, I think that especially when I was raised in an interesting mix of that as well. I had really conscious, PhDs in counseling on one side of my family, and some less conscious communication styles on the other side of my family. And I think it's easy to get into a pattern or a programming with how we operate and how we deal with conflict, or how we, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or avoid things when they're heavy or intense or emotionally triggering. And that just because we've been that way, or just because we've learned that way of functioning, doesn't mean that we're incapable of doing it differently. And even though it's uncomfortable, some really powerful connection can come out of being willing to have those hard conversations, and being willing to clean something up that feels messy, or express something that's true for you, even though maybe it doesn't seem like the space to share it all the time. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the courage that requires, or what you've seen happen with people when they start broaching into this level of depth?
Sure. I'm not somebody who seeks out confrontation, and my blood pressure goes up as soon as I sense confrontation coming. But I've had some really effective, powerful conversations over the last year that felt incredibly difficult to start because there was a level of tension or disagreement. But afterward, I felt this immense relief, and those relationships ended up being stronger. So in one case, I confronted a colleague who I felt wasn't really addressing her criticism directly. It felt a little bit indirect, and I thought our team would be better served if she would be more direct. So I did bring that up, and it felt really awkward in the moment. But afterward, I ended up following up with her directly and, making sure that I hadn't rubbed her the wrong way or given her the wrong impression. But I felt like our bond, our collegial bond, as it were, was that much stronger. We just had a level of respect for each other, for being able to say how we felt. And that gave me the courage to have some other conversations in my personal life with friends, with family. And again, it never feels easy. But I think the more experience we gain and the more memories we start to retain of what happens after, the more courage that we build for ourselves. And we can look back and think, oh yeah, remember that time that I did call this person out? And afterwards, we ended up having a good talk about it and we came together over it. That is something that I want to do more of. So in some ways, it's many of our greatest fear, and it can also build our greatest resource, our greatest strength.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think it makes logical sense to the mind that it is a scary thing, that we don't want to hurt others. We don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want to feel vulnerable. And it is through those things, through those conversations, when we're willing to show up and say, you know what, I could say a little more to clean this up better, or I could actually extend myself to check on that person, to bring it to just a slightly cleaner place. And that is a muscle that we build. The more that you do that, the more you realize that the world doesn't come to a crashing halt most of the time. The more that you realize you have that capacity and that you can begin expanding that and doing it, with more intention or more finesse as you go along. So what are some of the strategies or tools or techniques that you help people with, that you give them to maybe start having those conversations, or to consider having those conversations with a little more dexterity?
Sure. Well, I like the acronym API. Assume positive intent, because the chances are the last time or the next time that your feelings are hurt, or that you read an email as an angry email, the person who wrote that or said that didn't really mean to come across in quite that way. Most of the time, people mean well. They might have some assumptions behind what they're saying that makes it come out in a more exasperated tone, or maybe it's really curt in an email. But I try and think first, what is the most positive interpretation of what this person is saying that I could be reading into it or interpreting it incorrectly? Sometimes it's, oh, this person has a really self-critical voice, and that's coming out in how they speak to others, because they're so careful about their own work and they're always trying to do a great job. And so they're kind of projecting that a little bit into the conversation. Sometimes it's that the person is just really stressed out, and you can call it out and say, hey, seems like you're a little bit upset. I have a hard time thinking that it's about this issue. Do you want to talk about what's bothering you? Or maybe you want to leave this for tomorrow. It's totally okay. So API, I have that written on a little sticky. I keep that in front of my laptop. It's really helpful when you get a lot of emails and some of them seem strange or curt or blunt. Has that ever happened to you, Molly, where you kind of read an email and then you went back and you thought, oh, maybe this person wasn't actually using the tone that I thought they were the first time you read the email?
Yeah, definitely. And I can definitely perceive it the other direction too. If I wrote an email where I was like busy and it was short and then didn't get a response, or didn't get the response I thought, I'm like, oh, let me clean that up a little bit. Let me say a little bit more about where I was coming from, so that they can not read into it the wrong direction. It's like you can almost perceive you can almost see your own communication through a different lens when you start to become more aware of that. And it's good to reaffirm, to acknowledge people, to share a little bit more if you think maybe you came across that way. But yeah, I think the really important thing is that a little more communication can go a long way in fixing something up and cleaning something up, if you notice that. And that can be on the receiving end or the giving end.
Totally. So it goes back to that idea of seeking to understand before we're understood. So if somebody seems confused or maybe miffed about the way that you worded something, you can say, oh, thanks for flagging that this wasn't clear. Thanks for bringing this up. And almost in a way, you're thanking them for introducing a level of conflict, because it's an opportunity for you to clarify and make sense of the situation. And wouldn't that be so much better than someone who avoids and doesn't say anything. And maybe they go away and they're like, I'm just not going to work with that person anymore because she doesn't get me. You know, Janna's clueless. I would so much rather have somebody say, I don't get this at all. Don't you mean this? Or I think you missed something. And that sometimes can bring out defensiveness, but I'll always welcome direct questions when it gives me a chance to resolve something. Like you said, Molly, bring more communication and nuance to that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that feeds into everywhere. If you start practicing that in your professional life, it feeds into your home life. It feeds into your, friendships and relationships. There are a couple people in my life who go out of their way to call and stay connected and actually check in. And it's like, those are deeper friendships than anyone else in my life because they bother to do the over communicating part. They actually want to know. And that sets an example for everyone else in your life that you come across. If somebody sees you doing that in a professional capacity, whether they're triggered by it or whether they're, just witnessing it and seeing it happen, it inspires that courage or it inspires that kind of behavior, that level of communication in others without them having to know that that's happening or, choose to go absorb it or study it, that we create examples that inspire other people to behave that way when we go out in the world walking like that.
That's such an important point because all the time we're being observed if we're in a group, even if it's a meeting like a Zoom meeting, Teams meeting, and whether we choose to speak up or not becomes the standard for the group. A colleague, somebody who looks up to you, even a manager. I've had people come to me and say, I'm really glad that you brought this up, or I'm glad that you confronted this issue. And I was doing it more for my own sense of clarity or sense of purpose. But I'm always struck by how you can set an example and then maybe those future conversations with people that you struggle to communicate with become that much easier for everybody. And that's awesome. It's like a hidden silver lining. I love that.
Yeah. Totally. I remember, I don't know if it was in health class or what, but growing up, they start teaching you, or at some point, they tried to teach us, when you, I feel, blah, blah, blah language. And I know there's, at least in the communities that I'm a part of now, there's a lot of beautiful awareness around authentic relating and how to do communication and relationship on a deeper level with more vulnerability, with more asking, with more consent and things like that. I'm wondering if there are maybe some little frameworks or tools that you have for what are things to maybe ways to frame something when you have something to clean up with people, or just some tools for how to broach these kinds of subjects or have these kinds of conversations.
Sure. I love this example. It's from the book, You're Not Listening, What You're Missing and Why It Matters by Kate Murphy. And it's what she calls a support response versus a shift response. So we've all been in those conversations, and I'm sure you can think of an example, Molly, where you say, oh, I was walking down the street and I happened to see a turtle crossing and I stopped my bike and I got out and made sure the turtle could cross the street. And the person listening maybe says something like a non sequitur, or they say something like, oh, I hate turtles, or something that just shuts things down. Or they'll say something that's completely unrelated, like, oh, what are you doing after work, as though they didn't hear you. This is what is called a shift response. And this happens a lot. And it's almost like a form of conversational narcissism. So it's just squashing any chance for connection. It's basically shifting the attention to the other person for whatever reason. Maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe they want to talk about themselves. It doesn't really matter. But the good way to handle it is something called a support response. So you want to ask questions related to what happened and how did it feel? So Molly, were you worried that, there was a car that was going to come and hit you, or were you worried that the turtle might not have enough time? I'm using kind of a silly example here, but it's showing a desire for connection, to understand how you felt during that moment. And maybe was there a level of tension or concern? And this is pretty easy when I'm describing it. Nobody listening to me right now is going to think, well, I would never, make the conversation about me. But I can tell you, I've done this in the last week and I caught myself out. I'm not proud of it, but we get caught up in our own emotions and the momentum of life and what's happening. And it's very easy to shift back to ourselves, or it's a little bit less of an opportunity to connect, or sometimes it shuts it down. So I'd say one of the ways that you can help yourself if this is a problem, maybe you've got racing thoughts. Maybe you are thinking of what you're going to have for dinner. That's always a popular topic. Maybe you are worried about a deadline. If you're distracted, come back to the conversation by silently repeating what your conversation partner or the speaker is saying in your head. And again, super simple concept, but it's a little bit tricky to actually implement it. So start to repeat the words that they are saying so that you are not focused on the ingredients you're missing for the lasagna or whatever it may be that you're wondering about. Have you ever noticed that habit that, either in yourself or others where you
Yeah,
found it?
definitely. I think, yeah, especially my mother and I have spent more time together lately because I've been visiting her and helping her move some things around in her house. And we both have so many projects going on at the same time that it's really easy to do that shift response and really easy to be caught up in our own like timeline of how we're communicating or what we're thinking about and wanting to focus on that when we're having a conversation. But yeah, bringing it back to just deeper listening. What is this person actually trying to tell me? And how can I receive that? I think in some books they call it bids for attention. It's like it doesn't have to be an
Yes,
important story about a turtle crossing the road, but this person's sharing it with me probably because they want to connect. And how can I
exactly.
receive that and like be really present for that moment of connection, regardless of what the material of the topic of the conversation is? Because that's what we're here for. We're here to connect with other humans, and actually be
Completely.
present. Yeah.
Completely. And sometimes you just brought up the question, like, why are they telling me this story? People don't start with what's really on their mind. And again, this seems super obvious when we call it out, but often people will start with small talk, chit chat. How's the weather? Guess what happened? Did you hear about the local sports team? Whatever it is. Because that feels a lot more natural to us and less intimidating and less vulnerable than having to immediately start out with, I'm really stressed out about this. Because most of us don't have that level of connection in relationships. We want to kind of warm up the other person as well and just say, this is kind of what happened to me recently. Oh, and by the way, I've been really thinking about this thing that is on my mind. So I think what we can do, exactly as you say, Molly, it's listen and assume the other person is telling you because they genuinely want to connect. They genuinely want this conversation to be an opportunity for connection. And when you see it that way, it becomes less annoying too, because you're not frustrated by, why are you telling me this? It's more about, oh, okay, this person's probably going to get into something else. Let's hear it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you come at it with that awareness, you become the space for that vulnerable share. When you answer that bid for connection or attention or whatever, that you become that safe place where they can share more vulnerably. And that's a space, I don't know. I think most of the people listening to this podcast agree that's probably a space you want to be. You want to be a safe place for people. You want to be a place of support for the people in your life that you love or for the people that you're hopefully trying to collaborate with professionally.
Absolutely. And it's such an easy way to build rapport. It doesn't cost you anything, maybe a few seconds or moments. But when you look at the ratio of positive interaction, I guess the magic number is 5 to 1. So this is the relationship researcher John Gottman. So that for every negative feeling or interaction between partners, and I think you look more at marriage, but this can be business partners, siblings, friends, there's got to be at least 5 positive feelings or interactions. So the more you can outweigh the negative with the positive, the easier it is to trust that person and feel like you're in good hands the next time you're together. So even though that conversation may feel trivial, it may feel beside the point if there's something urgent to be discussed, it is such a great way to build trust and rapport and show that person that you're there for them. You're answering that bid for attention. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And to bring this back to those of you out there who are running a business, I know we're often talking to healers and holistic practitioners and coaches on this podcast, that level of connection, that safe space for vulnerability, the more you create that, the deeper your work goes. The more you create that safety, the more you create that connection, the more impact your services can provide, the more compelling your offers and invitations will be, because you created that sort of platform of connection. So being a good listener, being willing to clean things up when they get messy, those are all really, really valuable skills for your business, in addition to being valuable interpersonal skills for your life and your partnerships.
Totally, totally. And you might be wondering, what about people who are difficult? What about people who come at me with conflict straight away? The fact is, a lot of what we're doing every day is negotiating, right? So whether you are doing a business transaction, or you're trying to get your 5-year-old to go to bed, you're in a negotiation. And if you want somebody to say yes to anything, it's a negotiation. So this comes from the book, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. I highly recommend this. I've listened to it several times. It is so practical, but it's also entertaining because he used to be an FBI hostage negotiator. But the key is really getting onto the same page, right? So he talks about something called tactical empathy. And a lot of the time, negotiations or basic interactions, because most people won't label them a negotiation, they're going to feel like there's a bit of tension at the start, whether it's what are you going to eat for dinner, and maybe your partner, your kids disagrees, or where you're going to go on vacation, or that business opportunity where the client doesn't understand the pricing, or maybe they feel like your pricing isn't fair or doesn't reflect the value of the work. You really want to find common ground. And how do you do that? How do you find common ground? It's about empathy. And in the moment, it might feel really tough to actually feel empathy, because you might feel defensive. You might think, why can't they see my value? Why can't they see that my work is worth what I'm charging for it? So the way that you have to approach that is listening, right? Listening is a superpower. And yet so many people are focused on persuasion. If you look at any TED talk about speaking with persuasion, there's going to be so many more listens or watches to that TED talk versus how to listen better, because nobody thinks they're a terrible listener, or if they do, they might not take it seriously. I won't go into all the details about Chris Voss's tactics, but I highly recommend that book. It gives you some idea of how to arrive at a place where both people can walk away feeling like they got something. So it's not about win-lose. It's not about splitting the difference. It's about finding a way to authentically connect and get to the same place so that you're both working with trust. And maybe you don't, maybe you're not best friends with this person at the end of the day, but there's some trust and there's some respect. And that is so key to having authentic relationships and interactions with clients too.
Yeah, absolutely true. I forget where I heard this, but the idea is like only one person can really be gotten at a time. So if two people are showing up in a conflict, trying to get the other person to understand where they're coming from, it can escalate. It can be more tense. But if you're willing to be present in that moment, okay, maybe my stuff is up, maybe I'm triggered, but I understand that this person needs to be gotten right now. So let me understand them. Let me hear them out. Let me receive what they're trying to say, connect, and get them. And then once the person feels gotten, some of their tension can diffuse, and that's when you get to be gotten. It's like one at a time. It can't necessarily happen at the same time when emotions are heightened and things are up. So that's a good reminder too of recognizing. I think that speaks to that empathy, strategic or tactical empathy, whatever you said that was.
Tactical empathy, yeah.
Tactical empathy, yeah.
And maybe another short form way to remember it is, don't get furious, get curious. So, yeah. And that goes for two people. If somebody's furious, get curious about where they're coming from, because that will diffuse rage and anger and tension faster than anything else you can say, is to genuinely, and when I say get curious, I don't mean impose your point of view like, well, you're probably just not understanding. It's genuinely try and understand where that tension is coming from. Is it that they saw the wrong price list? Is it that the last person they worked with charged a lot less, but they also didn't deliver the value that you delivered? Or maybe it's they're having a bad day. right? And maybe all they need is a few moments to acknowledge that and have somebody hear them out. Because so often we keep it in, we don't get a chance to talk about it. But yeah, I love that. Don't get furious, get curious. And you can actually have fun with it
A good
sometimes.
motto for sure. So you do this with businesses, you do this with organizations, you sort of bring this to the table, right? Will you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing with companies?
So, most of what I do is communication strategy and writing. So, I don't get to practice this every day, but where I do bring this is in my podcast. I've reviewed all the books that I mentioned today in Audiobook Reviews in 5 minutes. And I try to bring speakers on to my other podcast, Access Ideas, who can embody some of these beliefs and these practices. And in my corporate work, I try and coach colleagues and leaders as much as possible on how to communicate effectively, because it really is the core of most jobs. There's very few jobs at this point that require no communication. And with the prevalence of AI, it's only going to become more important. You know, what are the prompts you're putting in to AI? Well, what are the prompts you're putting into your life? What are the prompts you're putting into your relationships? And I hope that theme of prompting will get more people to think about the nature of the types of questions that they're asking, and maybe think of asking better questions along the way.
Totally. Hope so. Hopefully this conversation sparked some ideas too. Your homework, if you're listening to this, is think about one conversation or relationship that didn't go quite as you'd like it to recently, and see if you can find the courage to clean that up. Get curious, ask deep questions, and see how it feels after, if the connection feels deeper or if it actually was a bad idea. Not everyone is going to go as planned, but overall, building that muscle and deepening those connections, being willing to clean something up if it doesn't land quite right the first time, it's almost always going to feel better and fill your cup more in the long run.
Yeah. And at a very minimum, even if it doesn't go over as planned, you are showing up for yourself. And that counts for something, because you're not backing down, you're not avoiding it. And I think that builds confidence and courage in the long run.
Definitely. Absolutely. So we're going to put the links, your website, jannastam.com, which is spelled JANNASTAM.com, in the show notes of this episode. Is there anywhere else people should go to follow your podcast?
Sure. You can find both podcasts on any of the major streaming platforms. It's Access Ideas and Audiobook Reviews in 5 minutes. You can feel free to connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear if you had an idea for a new podcast episode or if you have some feedback. And don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, Janna. Any last words of wisdom you want to leave people with?
Well, just keep going, just keep practicing, and don't give up, because it is so worth it to have better relationships and good communication.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you, everyone out there, for listening. And whatever happens, keep asking big questions and taking bold action, because you're here for a reason. See you next week.